Okay, so we measured, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. I can answer any other questions later about the measures, but we measured social anxiety symptoms using the social phobia scale from the SCARED. As I mentioned, that was from Child Report. For our measures of parenting, we had a series of interaction tasks, but the one that I'm going to tell you about today is one where we had a 8-minute task where the parent and child had to talk about some problems in their relationships, and they were given a list of kind of common problems to get them going if they had trouble generating something. So they're discussing this problem of, not doing chores or whatever it was for that particular dyad. And then we later rated that 8-minute segment for a variable we call positive engagement. We initially had rated warmth and how involved and engaged the mother was, but these two things turned out to be highly related, so we're calling that positive engagement. That's kind of our conceptualization of the acceptance dimension. And then in terms of control, we were particularly, because we're interested in emotion, as you'll see in a minute, emotion regulation variables, for the parent-child control dimension, we focused on psychological control. And if you're not familiar with that construct, psychological control has to do with trying to control your child by manipulating their emotions or their feelings. So it includes things like trying to guilt your child into doing things, denying their perspectives in terms of how they feel, and so on. We had a measure of attachment that was designed to get at children's attachment representations in their relationship with their mother. And so we did what's called a story stem interview, where you start to tell stories with dolls and props, and they have an attachment-related theme to them, and then the child has to finish the story, and you code it based on how the child tells the story, including things like how coherently they can tell a story. And so this may, if you're familiar with the research on attachment, we did something a little bit different than is often done. We classified children into a best fitting category, but also rated them for each of these 4 attachment patterns on a 5-point scale of degree to which they showed that pattern. And those are the data. I'm actually going to show you the rating data today. It kind of gets around the problem that in any sample you have relatively few kids of a particular insecure type. And then we had, as I mentioned, a mother report of behavioral inhibition, which, as we've heard the last 2 days, is one of the risk factors for anxiety disorders. So just to give you kind of the big picture first, I always like to start with nice zero-order correlations that are really simple to get the big picture. As you can see here, parenting was related to social anxiety, and it was actually stronger for positive engagement than psychological control. So the way to read this is children who are reporting higher levels of social anxiety have parents who are showing less positive engagement with them during this interaction task. In terms of the attachment findings, when you look at all 4 patterns, what we found is that really it was security and disorganization specifically that were linked to anxiety, social anxiety. And so it's the case that those kids who are reporting higher levels of social anxiety symptoms are rated on the interview as less secure and more disorganized. And then I put behavioral inhibition up here as well. So it was marginally significant, but was related to, mother reports of behavioral inhibition were related to child reports of social anxiety. So as a next step then, then part of the question is, so what's the unique role of the parent-child relationship variables in explaining anxiety? So I'm just going to show you the results of 2 regression analyses, in which we summarize this by looking at step 1, entering behavioral inhibition, and on step 2, entering either our parenting variables or the attachment variables. I'll show you in the next slide. And so this was just to test, our parent-child relationship variables explaining anxiety symptomatology after controlling for behavioral inhibition. And as you can see, if you look at the first R-squared change column, that's the really important one for this question, you can see that after controlling for behavioral inhibition, the 2 parenting variables explain in a significant additional 7% of the variance in social anxiety symptoms. And And a similar kind of a finding for attachment after you control for behavioral inhibition. If you look on step 2, the R-squared change is significant. Attachment's explaining a significant amount of the variance in social anxiety controlling for behavioral inhibition. So these findings are not due to, at least not due to behavioral inhibition. Of course, there's many other things that we could have looked at as well. So just to summarize what I've told you so far, in this study, we were showing that social anxiety symptoms are related to positive engagement by the mothers, related to attachment security and attachment disorganization in the child, and these parent-child relationship variables are explaining some unique variants, at least relative to behavioral inhibition. Small to medium effect sizes is what we're talking about. Okay, so that was just one empirical illustration, just to kind of illustrate some of the data on, what it looks like when you look at attachment and parenting. But as I indicated, what we sort of see as an important next step, and others have begun to do this as well, is to really ask more questions about, well, why do these links occur? Why is it that parent-child relationships are linked to anxiety symptomatology? And we've been particularly interested in the question of whether child emotional competencies might be an important mediator that can explain these links. If you think back to what I said, and I, of course, sort of set up the talk this way too, but when I think back to what I said about, what have people said about why parent-child relationships would be related to anxiety, many of the explanations really revolve around children's emotion skills, their emerging emotion regulation as potentially the explanation for why things like parental acceptance would be related to social anxiety. So I told her, well, it's because having an accepting parent creates this context in which there can be this open expression of emotion, and parents can teach children how to regulate emotions. So we've been interested in this notion that child emotional competencies may be an important mediator in explaining the link between parent-child relationships and anxiety. And this is something that specifically has not been tested yet as well, a direction people have not really looked yet. Now, we could conceptualize this, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the talk, in one of two ways. We might just think, you don't need mediating variables. It's just a direct outcome. You have a particular kind of relationship. You have one in which you feel comfortable and secure, and then therefore you have a secure base. You're not going to feel anxious. Or the alternative is, in the context of that kind of a relationship, a secure attachment, one where the parent is accepting, that it creates a particular kind of socialization context in which emotion regulation skills can be fostered, and it's really these emotion regulation skills that are the mediating these effects. So it's really kind of an indirect, parent-child relationships maybe are having a more indirect influence on anxiety, would be this explanation. And so in talking about emotion regulation, it's kind of like one of those interesting constructs, because you say the word and everybody goes, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And then you say to them, well, what do you think it means? And then you get, if you have 5 people in the room, you probably have at least 5 different answers. So there's been this whole debate in the literature about what emotion regulation is and how can we conceptualize it, and different people using the term in different ways. And so we've really gravitated toward Ross Thompson's definition, in which he's talked about how emotion regulation processes are involved in the monitoring, evaluation, and modification of, that should say, temporal and intensive features of emotion. I just realized I left something off the slide there. But he's really talking about that emotion regulation processes are involved in these intensive and temporal features of emotion in terms of monitoring your emotions. So are you aware of your emotions and how you're feeling in terms of things like evaluation? Are you reflecting on your emotions, making judgments about them? And your efforts to modify your emotions. So what do you do with your emotions? If you're feeling highly anxious, what do you do about that? Do you take active strategies? Do you avoid the whole thing, or do you take some active strategies to try to modify them?